So we have a series of questions. Some are addressed to both of you explicitly, and some of them will be addressed to one or the other. But when we, starting off, I guess one of the first questions we both had, which is to both of you, is broadly speaking, what do you see as the value of Congress as an institution, especially in contemporary times? How well do you think it's serving its purpose, and what do you think could be done to make Congress more effective?
Well, I'll start. There's one role that it's always had and it continues to have, and that is to intervene between citizens and the bureaucracy. I don't use bureaucracy as a bad word. I think America is very well served by the people who are at the federal level in particular. But there is a tendency to undervalue localism and and in fact, the much maligned earmark was a basic intervention by Congress on behalf of their constituents when they were facing an overly rigid bureaucracy. And I think if there were no Congress, you would have a lot more arbitrary activity and less political input into some of the decisions that affect people. I think it's the constituency service piece is a very important one. The next thing, of course, that it does more fundamentally, and that's the one where it's broken down some, is to set national policy, particularly domestically, and in particular the allocation of national resources. And it still does that, and that has to be done. It cannot be done by the executive, by itself. It's a representative way of doing it. The problem is now what would make it work better is not working as well now because of overly rigid partisanship. And that has led to, one, not enough happening, and then two, things happening too rigidly. So what the biggest advantage we could have right now would be a diminution of partisanship, and that has to begin with the Republican Party. The partisan problem has to be addressed in partisan terms. One of the things that has troubled me for a long time is the whole plague on both their houses, which you still see today. Oh, the politicians this, in fact, there's a very real difference in which the Republican Party first became and continues to be much more partisan, much more unwilling to compromise. I look at the financial crisis when the Democrats worked closely with George W. Bush, and then a few weeks later, Barack Obama's president, and he got zero cooperation from the Republicans. And the best thing that could happen would be for non-Tea Party, non-Trump Republicans, of whom there don't appear to be a lot right now, to take their party back and to get back to a less rigidly very conservative Republican Party.
Right. Bob?
I have 3 points I think important to make. One is that the corruption of the modern Congress by money is a very real phenomenon. And I think if you look at what's the H.R. 1, the Pelosi's first act, it addresses really serious problems. The fact that members now have to devote so much of their work week to raising money, and raising money means, don't forget it, calling people you don't know and asking them for money. It's not a healthy transaction. And it dominates the lives of most members of the House who don't have safe seats, and most senators all the time. If we don't find a solution to the problem vastly compounded by the Citizens United decision, I think we're really at risk of losing the democratic quality of the Congress. I think a lot of American history in my adult lifetime has been to describe and accentuate the gulf between the wealthy America and the rest of America. The 1% is a real phenomenon. There's no question in my mind that the 1% or the 5% at the top have absolutely disproportionate access to levers of power in the society, and money makes that easier, much easier for them to do. And I think people were too cavalier about it. Barney's a good example. Barney was lucky because he had strong support from home and never had to take this too seriously. And so, but a lot of senior people, Nancy Pelosi doesn't have to worry about money either, and so on, Steny Hoyer. I think that's had a corrosive effect because the people down the line who have to worry about it all the time know somehow intuitively it's sort of not polite to raise this subject with the speaker or the majority leader. There's not much internal discussion, in my experience, among members about the problem of being consumed by the need to raise money. There ought to be more. I've also thought in my adult lifetime that the Article 1 status of Congress, as I call it, the obvious intention of the founders that Congress be the preeminent political power in this society, always somewhat problematic, made very problematic by Lincoln in a way, but now, pretty much out the window. I mean, the idea that the president is less important than the Congress is laughable in the modern political context. And that's too bad, because the founders were right in their design, in my opinion. It's going to be fun to read Meacham on Madison. But Madison had a very clear-eyed view of what ought to evolve, that there ought to be not a parliamentary system, but a new kind of a system in which the House of Representatives was the closest to the people and then expressed the wishes and needs of the people most efficiently and effectively. And I don't think that's happened. I think we've lost that. The final thing I want to mention is the problem created, totally unanticipated, I suspect, by any founder, but enunciated so explicitly by Ronald Reagan in his first inaugural address. The government is not the solution, the government is the problem. The modern Republican Party has allowed itself to become, quite literally, the anti-government party. If the government does it, it's bad and we gotta stop it. Is really a governing ethos. And tragically, it's the problems that creates are compounded by the philosophy of life that I think we should credit Newt Gingrich with bringing to us, first of all, that the end really does justify the means. So if our purpose is to limit and hobble the government's ability to do things for its citizens, then any means we could come up with to achieve that goal is okay. And that really has been the governing ethos for a long time in the Republican Party. And that's bad. That's serious. It has real consequences.
I want to cover, Bob and I have one big difference here. I've always supported reducing the role of money. I'd like to see public financing. But I think people, particularly in the center and to the left, exaggerate the extent to which the money affects public policy. I mean, I think it would be nice to believe, it would be optimistic to say if we reduced money, we'd get less for the rich guys. I think, unfortunately, it's part of the American people. I mean, it wasn't campaign contributions that made a majority of the American people for many years oppose raising the estate tax or being for getting rid of it. It's a kind of Horatio Alger thing that's there. And I think you have to, money obviously has a very, very unfortunate effect in who gets elected to Congress. But I have found that in the day-to-day operations, it doesn't make that much difference. And the fact is that people get the money from people they would have voted for anyway. I remember newspapers that would talk about how the congressmen from North Carolina and Kentucky were getting such large contributions from the cigarette industry. Well, they were going to vote with the cigarette industry anyway. So I would like to reduce it. I think we get less there than than we could. And I am stuck on the nature of the American voters. Now, there has been this great change, and I think there's a hanging in the balance now is this. A large number of American voters who have traditionally opposed redistribution and bought into the notion that class warfare was a bad idea, they're now espousing it. They're now complaining about it. Paradoxically, though, they don't follow that up with support for the policies that would undo it. And that's the question, frankly, for the Democrats. Can we take advantage of this sense of unfairness and persuade people to do it? But here, Bob's last very profound point comes in. The problem is that to undo that, you need government. So we're in a vicious cycle. As long as people distrust government and don't want government to do anything, the problem gets worse. And the longer the problem gets worse, the more they distrust government.
Barney is more hopeful about this than I, but it's not that significant a difference in the sense that the real problem for me about the role of money in campaigns now is that what I mentioned, that it's such a distraction, and it's one of many distractions. It's now been established that members of Congress must continue to live in the district that they represent. Barney was very unusual in that he had a department in New York, in Washington, and spent weekends in Washington often. But that's not the norm. There are a whole series of conventions and patterns of behavior that discourage the development of professional lawmaking and lawmakers. These guys are professional politicians. They spend most of their energy, literally, cultivating voters and raising the money needed to reach voters. They do not master the subject matter of the committees they serve on, or the big issues of the day.
And that actually, I think about this for the first time, and I agree with that, but the point I would make is that it is true. The average member is spending less time, but I think the major impact of that is a reallocation of power within the institution. I mean, I think it did give me and Nancy Pelosi and Henry Waxman,
for sure,
that there is much more likely to be deference to the leadership, and my obligation as chairman of the committee was to try to minimize the political problems and to reassure my members, hey, you'll be okay, or I'll shape this for you. But I mean, I agree. There's much less of this on the part of the members, but it has, I think, increased the power of the leadership, particularly of those people who happen to be in pretty safe seats.
Mm-hmm.
But when the leadership is Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay, the result is not good.
Oh, absolutely. It's morally neutral.
Well, I mean, this is a great jumping point for our follow-up question. So I guess first to you, Congressman, especially in light of what you're talking about, what do you consider to be your approach to effective lawmaking?
What do I consider what?
To be your approach to effective lawmaking, what's necessary?
You start with your ideals. If you don't have a sense of how you would like to make the world better for people, you should not be seeking to exercise power over them. Once you do that, your job is to know the balance of power and figure out how you can best move in that direction. Legislating is a very unusual business, and you have to take this into account, and people don't fully understand it. It's one reason why I differ, I guess, a little with Bob about the primacy of the Congress. There are things that 535 people are just not going to be able to do as well as one in some cases. I think some issues go one way, some the other. But here's the deal. In everybody's lifetime, their formal official dealings with other people take one of two forms. Either they are part of a hierarchy in which there is a boss who can hire and fire people and give them orders, or they exchange money. I'll give you this money, you give me the car. Peculiarly, in an important institution in which people are formally aligned, neither one of those principles is available to members of Congress. A member of the House of Representatives or the Senate has no boss. No one literally can tell you what to do, how to vote, how to show up. There's no hierarchy. The people can fire you or a vast number of people back home. Everything has to be negotiated. And you can't do money. I mean, the members of Congress don't bribe each other. They may help each other with fundraising, but that's minimal. So you are in this situation in which it's all persuasion. And again, I can't think of any other job where there's nobody you can either give an order to or take an order from, and nobody who you can fire or can fire you. It is all conciliation. And that's my approach to legislating, is to recognize the lack of formal power, and then figure out how you accumulate the informal power. K-Roll and Lyndon Johnson is the best example of that. When I was chairman of the committee, or senior Democrat, my instructions to my staff were, if any member of our committee asks you to do anything, the reflex answer is yes. And if it seems to you unnecessary or either minor or annoying, we do it. My job was to do as many things favorable to the other members, particularly the committee that I needed, so that when I needed them, they had a vested interest in that relationship. It wasn't a quid pro quo, but it was always based on the fact that you were dependent on the free will of other people. I said doing something complicated is like doing a Rubik's Cube, where each square has a mind of its own and can decide what it wants to do and not want to do. So that's the job, is to combine strong feelings about what should be done with a recognition of that doing it requires persuasion. As I said last night, when I was asked once if I was worried that the speaker was going to be mad at me, I said, no, I'm not worried about my leader. I'm worried about my followers. They're the ones who can undo me. So that was my approach. And the last point is that what you look for in those situations, since it's all trading and bargaining, you order your own priorities, and you cannot treat everything that you think as equally important. There has to be a hierarchy in which, if you're lucky, other people will care much more about some things than you do, and you will care more about other things, and you can make a trade. It's a trade on issues, not a favor for favor.
Yeah, that's really. Yeah.
But there used to be, just 30 years ago, many more independent centers of intellectual influence in the Congress. Committee chairmen, when they had so much more power than today, had a real substantive role in government that has been lost, I think.
That's the point you made, though. They're distracted. They're raising money. They haven't got the intellectual and emotional energy to be independent factors. Yeah.
Well, that's a great, so turning directly to you then, and given your observations of Congress over all the years, you covered them for the press. If you think about today, 2019, give or take a few years, what do you think it takes to be an effective lawmaker in Congress today, especially for someone that might be less established either electorally or in terms of seniority, say someone like Congressman Frank was?
The weird, sad fact is that most members of Congress don't think about that. They actually aren't doing what Barney correctly prescribes, which is sort through your own ideals, pick some targets that might advance them, and pursue that. On the contrary, the average Tea Party member of the House is in this weird position of having been elected as a protest figure, who are known primarily not for what you're for, but what you're against. And your measure of success is sort of strange, pretty hard to extract, really. But you're a tribal leader if you're a Republican from South Carolina now, for example. Look at Lindsey Graham's behavior right now, with an election looming, anxiety about a right-wing primary challenge, which is, as Barney said last night, the biggest anxiety often for these guys. And how is he behaving? In a loony fashion. He's scurrying around, doesn't know what to do, looks foolish, is literally being ridiculed, but in South Carolina appears to be in pretty good shape. which is all he cares about at the moment. But all this has nothing to do with legislative achievements. And if Lindsey Graham were with us and we asked him, what is your primary legislative goal? I know what we'd get, a mushy kind of, well, I want to make sure that the military is strong and efficient and not in danger of being overtaken by the Chinese or anybody else. And, you know, a few other cliches like that. But he doesn't have a real sense. I mean, Barney Frank 20 years ago would say, I'm trying to find ways to build more housing for working class people that they can afford. It was a very specific target, happily achieved in some way, some measure. But how many young members come in now?
No, in fact, it's the other way around. It's one of the reasons we have this circuit of candidates for president, as Bob was saying. How many times have you read, well, I don't want them to just spend 20 years trying to get seniority in the House. I mean, being a House member is denigrated. In fact, you don't have to, if you know what you're doing and know how to work it, you don't have to wait to have influence. You have power as one vote, but that denigration of being a House member, you heard it from Pete Buttigieg, you hear it from Seth Moulton, or these people.
Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah, that's right. Now, and the way you do it earlier, I mean, obviously I talked about how as a chairman I try to maximize my capacity. Okay, what happened for most of the time when most of the people are in chairman? And what happens is you'll find yourself, because of the committee system, whoever you are, you're in the House, and you are in a particular constellation where there are certain issues that are within that jurisdiction, and there's a power distribution. What I did during that time would be to figure out which of the issues in that constellation were the most important to me, and then set out to try to get them accomplished. And generally the way to do it would be to try to find other areas where a majority, more powerful members, had a different set of priorities for me, and agree to support their priorities if they would include mine. Example, I wrote a chapter about it in a book on, I got on the immigration subcommittee, and I was determined to get rid of the provision in American law that began in 1900, and we finally got rid of it in 1987, that said gay and lesbian people cannot come to America. It wasn't often enforced, but it could be abolished sometime. Now, there was a major immigration package that people had. It wasn't a high priority for me, but it was acceptable to me. So I made it clear to the people there, this is in the late 80s, when I'm in my third or fourth term, I'm prepared to support the whole package if you'll include the elimination of the anti-gay provision. And that worked. And that became part of the deal. So that, wherever you are, freshman, wherever, you have a certain amount of power. You also have other members who you can influence. And the ideal at that point, when you don't have, the more power you have, the more issues you can deal with. But even at the very beginning, pick a couple of very high priority issues to you, morally valuable, important, and find a forum in which you can trade for them by supporting other people's priorities, not that you're opposed to, but that you are either mildly in favor of or a little more.
Or just indifferent.
Or indifferent, yeah.
That's very good. But for this to work, you've got to have individuals who are intelligent, who know some history and some public policy, who actually think it's important to worry about some of these things.
Yeah, by the way, the guy I made, the biggest deal I made on that was with the Republican, with Al Simpson, who was very eager to get the Simpson-Mazzoli bill through. Right. And Al and I became allied on this issue.
But if you don't have that raw material, human material to work with, it won't work. And my great anxiety is that the Barney Franks of the next generation are not going to think about Congress as a career choice. It just isn't on their radar.
By the way, I used that experience when I was chairman. I reversed that. If any member came to me with a high priority that did not disrupt the overall scheme, the answer would do it. But one of the points, talk about legislating, one principle I hammered home to my staff and others was ambiguity is not a reason, repetition is not a reason not to do something. A member would come to me, or one member's staff would come to another member's staff, increasingly unfortunately, and say, my boss would like this in there. And at first some of the staff said, oh well, they want to do this, but it's not needed. The bill does it anyway. I say, does it do any harm? No. Then it goes in. We're not short of paper. We have to print the same thing. So it was to accommodate anything any of the members wanted, as long as it didn't do any harm. But one other thing on the Republicans, in terms of, that's very relevant, Bob mentioned this about the negativism of the Republicans today. That's one reason why Democrats have had some problem and were being accused of being outmaneuvered. And Republicans, until recently, were able to still use the threat of government shutdown. And it's true, it does work some. And the answer is from a source that I rarely go to, the Bible. And it's King Solomon. In this story, the baby is government. And the Democrats are the real mother, and the Republicans are the fake mother making the claim. And when the question is, okay, we'll solve this by cutting the baby in half, the Democrats say, oh my God, I can't do that. We have to give in. And the Republicans are perfectly willing to cut the baby in half. And they win more often because that is an absolutely valid explanation of some of what happens. Being not caring, in fact, even preferring a totally negative outcome can be, it'll give you leverage.
And the public is not King Solomon in this, holding the baby deer and giving it to the Democrats?
No, the public doesn't follow it, although I take it back to Republicans. Yeah, that's good. The Republicans have started to pay a little bit more of a price for it. The biggest problem was when we thought the Republicans would pay a major price for it under Obama, when they sort of willfully shut down the government, and they were hurting. And then shortly after that, the Obama people screwed up the rollout of the healthcare bill. And that blew that off the stage.
That was an enormously consequential.
Yeah, it just reinforced the anti-government, anti-healthcare, took them off the hook for this. It was a major blow to us.
In terms of policy expertise versus sort of the political building up of a coalition, what's the nature of that trade-off? You were saying on the inconsequential elements.
You have to start with the expertise, which is partly yours. There are a lot of sources if you have the time and energy to do it. The administration of power, there are very good people who work for any administration. In my case, I began when I needed it some from the Bush people. Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson. But you have to start with the knowledge, because you can't negotiate until you can't trade off priorities until you know which ones are important. You have to have pretty good expertise. You can't, if you go in and negotiate, you don't know the subject, you don't know what you're giving away and what's important. But once you do that, then, the expertise comes first. And the more confident you are of the material, the better negotiator you're going to be.
In terms of building up that expertise, the extent to which you have that based on your prior profession and so on versus more based on learning on the job.
I worry about people who do it only from their own prior professional experience, because that is inevitably narrow and specific. In my experience, it is the first-rate people on the staff. I was blessed with wonderful people, some of whom I inherited from my predecessor. I got it from the administration, from the staff. One of the things that, Frank, it was helpful to me was that within the administration, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the top executives differed some with each other. So that Sheila Bair at the FDIC was fighting with Paulson and Bernanke. And that created some space for me so I wasn't the prisoner of any one group. And similarly, Geithner differed with, say, Gary Gensler. But you get it from your own staff and from the administration, and also from lobbyists. Because the good lobbyist, first of all, a good lobbyist understands the first time that he or she lies to somebody, they've blown it up. And yeah, I had lobbyists, including I talked to people at the Bank of America, which is in much in the district of mine, and I would talk to them about, in fact, just as we were in the final stages on the bill, I was marching in the Wellesley Parade and stopped off at the library to go upstairs to meet Brian Moynihan, the CEO, who lives in Wellesley, my constituent, and his political chief, the wife of Mike Barnacle, and they said, "Look, you're going to, you're determined to do this." I said, "Yes, absolutely." "Okay, can you do it this way instead of that way?" I said, "Well, that makes sense. We can do some of that." So yes, if you're in control and not in hock to them, they can be useful sources of information about how best to do it.
Two areas.
I mean, that's when I made a deal, both come together, that I thought was a secret until Bob put it in his book with the independent bankers.
The small bankers is awesome. Yeah.
I met with the independent bankers. They were critical to the bill, and it was on the Consumer Bureau. And what I said to them is, look, there was an amendment that had been offered by Luis Gutierrez to alter the ratio of payments for deposit insurance, taking some from the small banks and putting it on the bigger banks by changing the formula. And secondly, I came up with the idea that the small banks would not be independently examined by the Consumer Bureau, because that point was, we don't have enough people to be sitting with all these examiners. And the deal was, and I talked to the head of the IBA and said, if we do both of those, can you be neutral? And expected me for it. And he said yes. And to anybody. But he was so proud of it, and what he'd done, that he bragged about it to Kaiser, who put it in the book.
Which almost cost him his job, I think.
And
Two areas that don't get much academic attention that Barney has revealed here today are very important to the creation of legislation. One is staff. Staff role, I came to realize, reporting for this book, is just absolutely central to everything. Look, for example, and it's quite a good book, what's her name, who worked for Carl Levin on the Permanent Subcommittee for Investigations. Came out last year.
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's a good book. She's good. She doesn't write very well, but there's very good information. But the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations was really a very creative and exemplary use of the oversight power.
Started by, what,
Phil Hart?
Joe McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy, that's right, of course.
It was Joe McCarthy's instrument.
But it was completely staff-driven. Everything they did for 40 years, 30 years. And in a good way. I mean, the staff wasn't usurping power. It was acting on the priorities of the chairman. But they could get into subjects with a depth and a thoroughness that a member can't cope with. It's just beyond reach. And I mean, if you literally traced the Senate and House Banking Committee, Financial Services Committee staff performance on Dodd-Frank, I mean, there's absolutely no contest. The number of hours spent by staff versus the number spent by members on the particular specific hard questions, 100 to 1, 50 to 1.
Committee staff versus personal staff and the expertise they have.
Committee staff. It was interesting. Very few personal staff played a role in anything that I tried to find out about.
There is the defensive perimeter, keeping the member going and helping along. You can pay the committee staff more than the personal staff. It's more fun. It's more interesting. You're not dealing with hysterical constituents who think that their brains are being penetrated. But no question. The staff, and by the way, John Boehner, to his credit, recognized that. At one point, he burst out, meeting with bank lobbyists, and don't let some little punk staffer push you around. Whereupon I had printed up 1,000 buttons that said little punk staffer. And they were very popular. I still see them every so often, but that is the greatest bargain people have. They are very good, and you have to have that relationship with them. I mean, I spent a lot of time with them, but in fact, we still have a reunion. The staff of the committee, we have a Christmas reunion every year, ever since the
But the nature of staff work has been transformed by the lobbying business. Most staffers were like G. Russ Lanowick, Barney's staff director,
who I inherited.
who had long, multi-decade careers, which are now almost extinct.
Yeah.
Very few people spend so many years in the same place. Instead, they're lured away to become lobbyists, and for huge money. And it makes a cultural difference of great significance.
And they
And is that the combination of both the money opportunity, but also that they don't feel Congress is doing what they had hoped it would do on the legislating?
That's a good question.
I think the
I
line
can't
is part of
answer
it.
Yeah.
I mean, they come together. It's one thing to sacrifice significant income for something you feel is very worthwhile.
Right.
But if what you're doing isn't that worthwhile,
Right.
then the trade-off changes.
Right.
And the staff under Boehner, they weren't doing anything. There was nothing affirmative
Right.
happening, and that was therefore discouragement was easier to
Example of
come
the
by.
goal staff. When I became chairman, the parliamentarian of the committee had been a guy who worked for the House Bonjour. He'd gone to work for the Republicans. He's a very decent, very honest guy. And the first thing I did when I became chairman was to ask him to stay on, which he did, Tom Duncan. And he died earlier this year, and I made a special trip to Washington. I did many others, and we had a couple hundred people at a memorial service for him. There was a reunion of the committee staff and others kind of celebrating the joint effort, and it was symbolic. I'm not saying it was expressive of the role that they had played.
The second area is the degree to which the sitting administration shapes the business of Congress. Nobody likes to talk about this. The administration doesn't want to claim credit because they know that won't play well on the Hill, and the Hill doesn't want to acknowledge it because it would appear to diminish the significance of their own role. But the fact is, and I got Barney and Chris both to admit this ultimately, the work done in Geithner's Treasury Department was absolutely crucial to the evolution of the bill itself.
Because I never admitted, I acknowledged that from the beginning. In
Yeah.
fact, I didn't start until they sent us something.
Exactly, that was the
I
starting
did
point.
not start the work until we
Yeah.
worked on that
And
work.
there was a moment when the people on the committee, and Barney too, were frustrated because it was taking them longer than they had said it would take to produce the first
Cleaning up
version.
the crisis
Yeah.
took us longer.
Yes.
But it was also true during the crisis. We had to start with what Paulson gave us. We modified it some, but you just don't have the capacity to on something like that to do it yourself from the beginning.
So there's both too little administration involvement and too much administration involvement, I would imagine, on these major issues.
Why too little?
Too
The
little,
current administration, for example,
Yeah.
maybe? I mean, in some policy areas where it's just
Oh,
not engaging.
oh,
at
of
all.
course, yes.
Yeah.
No, we're in a period of abdication of governmental responsibility. Nobody really is paying attention, and we're going to pay for that enormously over time. It's tragic. And the worst aspect of it, changing the subject, is the number of people being driven out of the government.
Sure.
Michael Lewis's book is extremely important.
On the element, doubling back a little bit, the expertise that members have from their personal backgrounds and how that matters, we were also wondering more about the expertise that they bring in legislation based on having spent time in state
That's more
legislatures.
important and more constructive, because the thing I talked about having no formal power, no hierarchy, you live in a constantly 360-degree bargaining situation.
Right.
With that, state legislatures, there's a lot of similarity to that. But again, to go back to the personal experience, more often than not, when people cited their personal experience, it was narrow and specific and was not helpful. Nobody's, you're legislating big and broad policies. So I never found that people, well, in some cases, I take it back. Bob mentioned Jim Hines, who had been in the financial industry, and he knew some stuff. about what we were doing
About
here.
derivatives particularly,
What's that?
about derivatives.
Yeah,
And
but that was
CTOs.
helpful about knowing the subject matter. But on the whole, people would be, and we had a lot of doctors in the house, and they, I think, generally did more. I mean, like, I guess the best example is,
Mr. Price.
well, the eminent heart surgeon, Dr. Frist, who looked at Terry Schiavo and said he could tell from watching her on television that her eyes were following what was happening. And then, of course, they found out that her eyes were just jelly, that her brain had ceased to exist, and there was nothing behind the eyes.
Other backgrounds?
I would say
Yeah.
personal interest, personal experience
Yeah.
does create subject matter interest. Not expertise for legislation, but just, I want to be on that committee because that's what I know about, is a very natural and common instinct for a new member. And that people choose their avenues often based on what they've done before. I wonder what the percentage of House members now who started their careers or at some point served in the state legislature. I wonder how that percentage has changed. I think it's way down, but I'm guessing. I'd like to know. It's very relevant. Because if you read Barney's book or the biography of Barney by Stewart, what's his name?
Wiseman.
You see how much of his legislative skill was a product of his master's legislative experience. It wasn't about the substance of issues. It was about how to make deals, about how to listen to people
Getting used to
and pick up what they're really
very
saying.
unusual situation which nobody can give anybody any orders, and you have to just,
Right.
you're in this constant
Cajolery.
bargaining, cajolery.
Right. Some of the other backgrounds, so we've seen declines, but now perhaps a resurgence in veterans in Congress.
Yeah.
Does that matter? People with JDs in Congress, does that
I
matter?
don't think if you randomize that, you would see that any significant difference. That is, that they're all over the lot in terms of issues.
Did you
So
think
there
your
are
own,
belligerent veterans and pacifist veterans.
Yeah.
turning to the law degree in particular, I mean, do you think your own legal background helped you?
No.
Okay, there we are.
No, the legal background helped in the state legislature. What we think of the laws, the state legislatures make the laws, the property laws, the criminal laws. Congress is more of a resource allocator. The one area that I have advised people when they say to me, I want to be in public policy, I want to go to Congress, I want to work for Congress, what should I study? The answer is economics in general, and in particular, accounting. A very large percentage of the debates are debates about accounting. Is Social Security going to run out of money? What is the deficit? Accounting issues are how much capital does a bank have or should it have? Accounting is a much more significant factor because things are not as simple as they seem. And then economics in general. I don't think whether you are a lawyer or not makes any difference.
Bipartisanship. I want to talk a little bit about that. Is described, in high-profile issues that there isn't much bipartisanship today.
Republicans killed it.
That's changed, but on lower-profile issues.
Unfortunately, no. That's one of the Cambridge things is they poisoned it. It may be coming back now, but and it really is this sharp drop from the bipartisanship under Clinton and Bush.
Very important.
A lot of bipartisanship, but when Obama came in, then it just sharply came to an end.
It's an underappreciated, abrupt discontinuity. And the story of the dinner at the Capitol Grill on the night of Obama's inauguration. It's in the book by Draper, is it? Where the House leadership, Republican leadership, agreed we're going to block everything he proposes. And then McConnell takes the Republicans on a retreat
and then
to West Virginia and does the same thing. They actually openly, we now can say openly, it wasn't open at the time, but they conspired to abandon
Yeah, and Frank Lange.
all efforts.
All you want to do is make it negative, and that then what happens that is, theoretically you might work together in small issues. People get angry at each other, so that there's much less on any level. Little of it may be coming back now, but
The elimination, as I discussed last night and elsewhere, the elimination of personal relationships, going and having your kids in the same school in Arlington, Virginia, and so on, has had a huge impact. These people don't know each other, and they come to town now, having run a vicious negative campaign, and they're supposed to turn around and make friends. No, it doesn't work.
and the earmark thing, that was one of the areas of bipartisanship. People, there was geographic, work together. I worked together with a Republican who, for 4 years, represented the Fall River to create the New Bedford National Park. So there is really very little.
It's a wonderful issue, earmarks, which I wrote about in the So Damn Much Money, but it's because you can argue philosophically and religiously, ferociously against it as corrupting and bad, but Barney's absolutely right. It's as a source of grease in the system
And of localism, particularly in highways. I mean, I was often working with local people who were telling highway engineers, I know we'll take a little slowdown. That's a nice area. We're worried about traffic. That was the most constant point of friction.
And Tip O'Neill and the Big Dig, one of the great stories.
So within the parties then, we see some intra-party kind of factionalization. Some of that is set up via caucuses. What do you see as kind of the power either to promote legislation or to stop legislation of Congressional Black Caucus, New Dems, and so on?
Well, it's the Black Caucus works the way I said before. If you have a higher priority than other people on some issues, then you go along. I mean, the Black Caucus agrees to help the Democrats make a majority. In return, it gets priority on some of its issues.
And it gets the seniority system.
Yeah, well,
This
that's
is
a big deal.
A really important, underappreciated, and not necessarily positive fact that the House Democrats are committed to the seniority system because that's the way you pay off the flags, and because they have so much of it, seniority.
Right.
And it's when they're good, it's fine, and when they're bad, I mean, what's his name? For Jim Conyers from Michigan was really out of it as chairman of the judiciary, did not have all his marbles, and nobody dared raise the issue.
He claimed, by the way, that he was not as old as people said because he had falsified his biography because he was too young when he got elected and he thought people would disrespect him, so he made himself 3 years older. But no, the internal becomes less important as the cross-party thing becomes. I mean, the more partisan things are, the more pressure there is to go along with your party. Although the Democrats did just run into a problem, obviously, on the budget. So there is some, but both parties are much more unified than they used to be. Democrats to the left, Republicans to the right. In fact, what's very interesting from the kind of comparative politics thing, when I was younger, the political scientists, James Riega Burns and others, late 40s, 50s, Chet Schneider, there was this envy that American political scientists had of the party unity in England.
Yeah.
And now it's totally reversed. America has become overwhelmingly party unity, and the House of Commons is a shambles.
Going with that sort of comparison, if the U.S. were in a similar situation of needing to negotiate something akin to Brexit, is there some benefit to the Congress style we have?
Well, in this case, yeah, because the president could do it and it'd be up or down. But it still might go down. I mean, look, it's not as important an issue, but at this point, apparently, Trump hasn't got the votes for the post-NAFTA agreement.
Right.
But the old one stays in force, right?
Yes, it does.
Right.
Well, no, he's going to pull out of it. He has the unilateral right.
He can.
Time has passed, so he can unilaterally pull out. Actually, that's best, not directly relevant to this. But for a great deal maker, Trump has made
No deals.
no deals that have. The NAFTA one's only one, but not North Korea, not China, not Iran. He has He has a total lack of success of deals. He also, for a man who's a great chief executive, has this incredible record of appointing people who he himself shortly after decides are total incompetence. The head of his Federal Reserve, the defense secretary, the chairman of
Secretary of
the
State.
attorney general. I mean, he denounces his own people.
Is this an example of something larger about business people entering politics,
No,
or is it
no.
idiosyncratic?
It's
Just him.
a product of narcissistic personality disorder.
House versus Senate.
Yeah.
When you were advancing legislation through the House, obviously that's a complex, as you were saying, Rubik's Cube style. How much did you have to take into consideration what's doable in the
I
Senate?
think one of the things that Bob talks about that I'm proud of is the very good relationship Chris Dodd and I had.
Yeah.
House Senate tensions is often a problem. There were two relationships I was proud of. The other was with the generally very conservative Democrat who would chair the Agriculture Committee, Colin Peterson, because we had shared jurisdiction over derivatives. And he and I worked very hard, and that worked very well. But yeah, Chris and I, we were friendly and worked very close together. And basically what would happen would be,
And so did the staffs.
yeah,
Because they did, the staff saw it was okay.
and there's often staff friction about
Yeah.
jealousy and we
Territoriality.
avoided all of that. Chris would, from time to time, well, first of all, he had a major impact on the shape of the bill. People talking the bill's too big. Our original plan was to pass 5 or 6 separate bills. I mean, this bill is very big because it's the equivalent of 6 or 7 bills that passed in the New Deal, the Securities and Exchange Act, the Bank, Glass-Steagall, etc. And Chris said to me, I said, we're going to do, he said, hey, pal, I'm going to have a hard enough time getting 60 votes once. Don't make me get 60 votes 9 times.
Yeah.
So we treated it as separate bills as we marked them up, and then they were consolidated to go to the floor. But then on some other issues as well, Chris would say, I can't, I need you to do this, I can't get this through. And a couple of times he would say, he'd say, Mary Landrew's got this issue, you got to take care of her, I can't get this through. So we would do that. I mean, I had to accommodate him more because he needed 60% and I didn't. So he had a tougher road to hoe.
I mean, building on this point, and I guess this is turned to you, given all your observations of the House and Senate over those years, but can you point out other examples beyond Dodd-Frank where you could think of situations in which the House and Senate worked really well together over extremely contentious issues?
Healthcare.
Well, that's
Chris Dodd again was a very major, very important factor.
Anything prior to the
I'm trying
Obama
to think
administration?
before the Senate that I covered in the 70s.
Well,
Conference, the changing role of the conference committee, role and methodology is also a good academic subject that I don't think has been much addressed. But conferees in the 70s, individual members, had enormous influence because both houses and the leadership of both houses acknowledged the role of the conferees to really rewrite the bill if they needed to get a consensus.
in fact, you could sometimes let a contentious issue go over and not have a vote on it in either house with the understanding that it would
be
be
dealt with in
fixed in
conference.
the conference report and you could
And
not be
nobody-
subject to a separate vote.
And nobody's fingerprints would be visible.
And
was-
then, then it was yes or no, they couldn't do it.
Right. And that, I mean, the Gingrich approach to conferences was to avoid them in all possible situations. And there was the Creative Conference Committee, which had that role of
And it came back
Fixing
again.
those
You notice
things.
people were very happy to have it because it solved the budget crisis this year. And they all talked about it. And Leahy and Shelby and Niederlowy and Kay Granger. They said, they told Trump to leave them alone. And they had a conference committee of the appropriators. And they solved it. By the way, just a linguistic point. It always bothered me. Conferee is a misnomer. We were, in fact, conferors. conferee is the subject of the conference. So the conferee, actually, legitimately, the conferees were the two bills, which were the subjects. The people who actually participated in the conference should have been called the conferors, but I dropped that fight.
We could reintroduce it into political science vernacular if you would.
By the way, that's an example of Nancy Pelosi when we came to do the conference committee. And it was the primary jurisdiction was the Financial Services Committee, but the Agriculture Committee had jurisdiction. The Government Operations had a little bit because of the structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Board, and I think there may have been one other committee. And she said, okay, let's go over your conferees. And I gave her, she said, no, wait, let's go over this. And she said, no, we got to do this and this. She said, I want you to have a majority of the conferees on any given issue, no matter what happens. I mean, that was her specific argument, and she was right.
It worked, and she saved you. What was the one thing you'd have been in trouble about? Can't remember now. If you hadn't had that, there was something substantive.
We had one on the preemption.
That's right.
When the New Yorkers were a little shaky. Chris Dodd, on the other hand, was upset because he did not have that. Harry Reid Chris had a minority from 4 were from agriculture and 3 were from banking or something. So Chris, or 4 and 5, and Chris envied me that he had a little bit more of a problem. But that was Nancy's skill and specific attention to detail and knowledge. No, wait, you sure about it? Oh, you're right. We gotta. So so I had a majority on every issue I needed.
That idea of the conference committee sometimes taking away the contentious issues that would have otherwise been voted on, to what extent is there also the limitation of contentious issues by kicking the can off to administrative agencies, by delegating some of the decisions, and what are some examples along those lines?
Well, in some of the cases, and I lost out on one, I wanted to ban arbitration. I wanted to make it illegal for a financial institution to require the customer to submit to arbitration and waive the right to go to court. That was in our bill. The Senate couldn't get that through because the Senator from South Dakota, Tim Johnson, and all the credit card companies hated it. So we gave the SEC the power to do it. A couple of times we did that. The other dodge would be to commit something to a study. That was I said at one point I was going to offer an amendment that any member who sponsored an amendment to create a study, within 3 months after it was completed, had to take a public test on what it said. But empowering an administration, we did that a couple of times. We gave the SEC the power to promulgate rules.
And the vocal rule, of course.
Yes.
And then the studies, do we ever see that they're followed up with legislation?
They are. Not with legislation, but the study emerges.
Okay.
Somebody has a vast pile of unread studies.
They're produced, whether they matter or not is a different thing. So,
yes.
Okay.
But sometimes you have to give jurisdiction. I mean, like the Volden rule was too complicated for us to write it.
Right.
We didn't mandate that. A rule along those lines had to be there. On arbitration, that was different. You could have mandated it, but we said, you decide whether you want to do it or not. The other one, I guess, was...
the fees for, what do they call the credit card fees?
Yeah.
So what was that delegated to?
Well, for the fees with the Consumer Bureau.
That's interesting.
Well, originally it was the Fed, because when we passed the credit card bill, we hadn't passed the Consumer Bureau bill yet.
That was default
But then
jurisdiction.
one of the things that the Consumer Bureau took powers from all the other bank regulators, took all the consumer powers and put them there, and so they inherited that, but it was originally in the Fed.
We've said that we have a kind of a different, maybe mix of folks who enter politics today and who are interested in the lawmaking functions. To the extent that someone's entering in the freshman class today and is excited about lawmaking, wants to make a policy difference, what's the advice that you would offer?
Well, I sort of said it before. Get on the best committees you can from the standpoint of your interest. Then look at the issues in that committee's jurisdiction. Figure out which ones you care the most about. And then look at the power alignment in the committee and try to figure out how you can trade your support for other people's priorities to get support for yours to be included in the committee's product.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's really a very good, concise statement, and it's accurate. I think the real question for me is how many people in the freshman class arrived with such an ambition in their head.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer.
No, more than thinking about it. Well, you know, one of the things that helped me, because it's true, I mean, one of the curses, everybody who's there thinking about going up to the Senate, people got thinking about advancement. I got elected in 1980, enormously grateful that I won it all, and convinced that I would absolutely never be able to do anything more than that. Freedom, nothing left to lose. I was going to be a congressman for 30 years, I hoped, and that helped me.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't worried about advancement. I didn't think I had the chance,
Why weren't you thinking about advancement at that point?
because I'm gay.
As,
Hey, you know, I'm lucky to be here, given the prejudice. 1980,
sure.
I wasn't going to be able to go anywhere else.
Anybody else?
Although I was, as the Washington Post pointed out, when I finally did come out, Pete Buttigieg was 5.
So the progressive ambition is hitting most members, you think? That?
More these days, probably because it goes to what Bob said, the denigration of being in the House.
Yeah.
You know, there's less prestige, and there's, although, you know,
It's also hard psychologically. I saw this again and again in my Washington career. Anybody gets elected to the House of Representatives, it's a big fucking deal. I'm a congressman. And then you come to town and discover that, yeah, but you're one of 435 congressmen. And in fact, you're way down the pecking order.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to take you a long time to achieve a position of any stature and significance. And for many people who are competitive, self-promoting people by nature, the discovery of this, the realities of the situation, is very painful.
and they have oversold in their campaign.
Yes, of course.
They've all talked about what enormously transformative people they're going to be,
Right.
and they ain't.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, there's a great piece of that Al Smith, when he got elected to the state senate in New York, he was up in Albany, and he talks about how he was, he was all puffed up, and he got to Albany, he was a member of the minority, and he was just being totally ignored, and he finally said the dog pissed on his shoe, and he thought that was probably symbolic of being a state senator in Albany, a freshman.
But how many people have you met like Barney? Not very many.
Right.
I mean, that's the kind of person that can have, Waxman is another,
Mm-hmm.
can really succeed at the system because of intelligence, patience, what my Yankee mother used to call stick-to-itiveness,
Mm-hmm.
all rare qualities in new members of Congress. It really makes a difference.
The nature of the job, I should add, what was the overwhelming number of my colleagues, it says something I think about Congress, wasn't a great secret that I was gay, but when I got down there, I was not keeping it a secret in Washington. I had repressed myself too much in Boston. And by the 84, 85, it was clear that at some point I was going to come out. And when I made that clear, 86, every liberal member of Congress with whom I worked closely, all of whom were 100% supporters of gay rights even back then, asked me not to come out. Pat Schroeder, Ron Dellums, and they said, you're a very valuable ally, and if you come out, it's going to make you marginalized.
Less
You're gonna be
valuable.
and I couldn't deny that, but I just said, but personally, I can't live this way. I got to do it. And when I did come out, many of them said to me, we were wrong. Yeah, we were afraid if you came out it would be bad for you, but you are so much happier now. And given the interpersonal nature of the way you get influenced, it improved my performance. I mean, that was a general sense of my colleagues, that I was better at this job of give and take and personal because I was not angry all the time myself.
When you arrived in Congress, were there some members you thought were, I'd like to emulate their lawmaking styles?
Yeah, actually early on, before I got there, I was a pre-vice presidential fan of Hubert Humphrey, who was a very effective legislator. And I thought Mo Udall's personal style was a very, very good one. In fact, one of my thrilling moments was I worked in Mo's 1976 presidential campaign, and in 1980 I got elected. I go to Washington as a member-elect, and there's a lame duck session, and I wanted to talk to one of the other members of Congress. So I said to the doorman, "Would you ask Mr. Shannon to come out and see me?" "Oh, sir, you're a member-elect. You can go on the floor if you want." Well, that's the first time I went on the floor. So I went from the door that comes in from the south steps of the Capitol. And as I walked in, I literally bumped into Mo Udall, who said, "Oh, hi, Barney." And that was just a transformative moment for me to really know he's now my colleague. But Mo was very effective. The other one who
What was your job in '76?
just speaking for him. I mean, I wasn't working full-time. Oh, I was in the State House. I was a state rep and campaigning for him. I remember one point doing
I covered that campaign for
we had a
6
debate
weeks.
before some Jewish group, and everybody sent his or her Jewish representative. Jimmy Siegel did Birch Bayh, and Milton Schaap sent Cloris Leachman. She was Milton Schaap's advocate, yeah. But the guy who I think was the best legislator I served with, and I saw that on Dave Obey. Now it's interesting because he was the meanest son of a bitch. David had the personality of a snake much of the time, but he was thoughtful and set it into a broader context. And I'd say he was the single best legislator. And we worked well together. He was chairman of the Appropriations Committee for a while. And from time to time, he would ask me to make an amendment because, as chairman, he had to preserve relationships with his ranking Republican. So I would do his dirty work.
How about Dingle?
I was never as impressed with John. I think he used his authority more than his skills, and I don't know, for some reason.
He's a bully.
Yeah, but David was clever, very, very skillful.
Same set of approaches and skills? It sounds like they were different than yours, so there's a different path.
I mean, he'd be angry, but it was the same sort of figuring out deals. In fact, he's the one, he told me one of the negative Bernie Sanders story, which was that he was trying to get the best deal for the Democrats on home heating assistance, and he made a deal with his Republican counterparts that he would get more money than he thought he could get if he went to the floor. But the deal was that there wouldn't be a vote on it. So he went to Sanders, who'd been a major advocate, and said, "I can get this, but the deal is no amendment, so can you accept that and not offer an amendment?" And Sanders said, "No." So Obey said, "Well, what number do you need so you wouldn't offer an amendment?" And Sanders said, "Oh, Dave, I have to offer an amendment. I'm the champion of this program." And he did the same thing with Debbie Stabenow, that he had to offer the amendment and screw the deal. No, Obey, well, he could be gruff in person, but he did all that negotiating and balancing and working things out and deferring to members on things that were important to them.
That's an important point. There are very few members of the modern House less popular with their colleagues than Bernie Sanders.
Oh, none.
And this grandstanding impulse is the single worst thing in terms of how your colleagues react to you. And he couldn't help himself. He was just horrible about it.
Does anybody pull off both of those? So those sound like their intention, the grandstanding kind of show horse, workhorse dichotomy, that they can come together?
Ted Kennedy was clearly,
Sure.
I mean, it's not that hard to do both. I had a pretty high public profile, but I think I was pretty effective. He just didn't care as much about the legislative outcomes. It may be in part because he was so far to the left that nothing made any difference, but I just think it was more that his ego was so strong.
Personalities, as far as are you willing to accept a half loaf
No, yeah, he's not.
type of thing.
No, very. I mean, I just. He was. He had to have his way, and he had to get the credit for it.
I'm thinking, I mean, turning to the contemporary Congress, and doesn't necessarily pardon me, it doesn't have to necessarily be the freshman class, but within the last, say, 10 years, especially in the years since your retirement, who among the younger cohort do you think has any of these qualities?
I don't know. I will say I left out one other guy who's become even more and more and very skillful. Steny Hoyer. He's very, in fact, Steny a couple of times because he had better relations with the more moderate members, although he's been very liberal himself. One or two times in the conference report, I went to Steny and said, I can't break this one. I've done. You have only so many asks, and Steny was very helpful in sorting that out. Of the, I don't know myself. I can report. There's a woman from who replaced Ed Markey named Catherine Clark, who's been put up into the leadership.
Yeah.
She's very highly regarded. My successor, Joe Kennedy, also gets very high marks from people for what he does. In my old committee, although he's not one of the newer members, it's about a cousin by a law firm of Bob's, Ed Perlmutter from Colorado. He's one. He's very good at it and very. He's the one who brokered the deal to keep Pelosi Speaker. He had been critical of her, and then basically conversations, and it was, she got the message that at some point she had to say that she wasn't going to be Speaker forever.
That's her life, yeah.
And he worked out the deal by which she was able to do that. Obviously, some others I haven't. I try not to look over people's shoulders.
Sure.
Go back there and do that.
And Bob, do you have any thoughts of the more recent, maybe not the complete rookies, but since the time that the congressman has left?
Well, I left too
Yeah.
in 14, so I don't feel up to date. Chris Von Hollen, a very interesting figure, not known in the country, but who's just extremely bright, hardworking.
Would have been
serious.
Speaker if he didn't run for the Senate.
Yeah, he would have. And I don't know anything about how he's doing in the Senate, but I'm sure his quietness is an asset, and he's not a grandstander. And very good.
Did you detect anything of women versus men, their lawmaking style? No.
No, I don't. I think that's a myth.
Some of the Republican women, like your new senator, are really nasty. What was that woman from North Carolina on the rules?
Virginia Fox.
God, she's a disgusting human being.
Yep.
And they were totally ineffectual as legislators because they were just vituperative screamers. It was.
As Congress is taking a larger oversight role right now, do we see oversight and legislation coming together in some context? Or are they separate?
It's a political substitute for legislation.
So you would see them as substitutes. Are there realms in which they are complements?
Can be, but not when you have divided control.
If you have, when you have an ability without Senate to get together, then oversight can lead to it. Well, Bob gave you an example. The permanent subcommittee that Carl Levin had, there was a point at which there was a stall in terms of trying to get to 60 in the Senate. And Levin had a hearing about, was it Goldman that had done something? Levin had a very good hearing about some terrible thing that Goldman did, and that broke the logjam for Chris. That was a case where the oversight spurred the legislation.
Added some public pressure.
Yes, and it wasn't a coincidence. They knew what they were doing on the Levin staff. They were trying to help.
That's interesting. I didn't appreciate that because the way the book reads, it seems that the lineup is almost serendipitous.
Well, this book that came out that I mentioned by this woman whose name I've forgotten, who was Levin's staff director, she's more candid about this, I
That's
think.
really interesting.
Yeah.
We've been going for quite a while. Probably maybe just one or two more questions, then we'll
Great.
do a break before the next.
I was with Dodd, by the way, on the accident. I was with Dodd in Davos at the beginning of 2006. And he said, I'm just so frustrated. I've been in the Senate 30 years, and I'm not chairman of anything. He said, I'm behind Ted Kennedy, Joe Biden, and Paul Sarbanes. Kennedy's this, Biden's that. And Sarbanes, Paul's heart beats about once a minute. He's never going to, Paul's very deliberative. And then about 2 months later, Sarbanes announced he was retiring. Chris became the chair. Similarly with me, they said I was fourth.
Yeah.
And then Chuck Schumer ran for the Senate, and Bruce Vento had mesothelioma, and John O'Falls was just get out. They were all, two of them younger than me, and O'Falls only a couple months older. So I became chairman purely it's a Tip O'Neill. Ed Markey went to Tip O'Neill when he got elected because he replaced a guy named Torbert McDonald, who'd been Jack's college roommate, who drank himself to death in his early 60s. And he won the seat, and he felt a little guilty about taking over, and he went to O'Neill and said, Tip, I just feel a little guilty that I'm so happy, but it was because Torby died. And O'Neill said, Edward, just remember, you are in a profession in which you will advance by the death, defeat, or disgrace of one of your friends.
That's a great story.
Glass half full sort of sentiment there. Okay.
So my last question, they've set up a select committee on the modernization of Congress. What can Congress do to fix itself, or is it all external?
There is such a committee?
There is.
Yeah.
There is,
I missed this.
Nancy set it up.
Yeah.
Who's in charge?
Derek Kilmer from Washington, and the co-chair is I can't recall the Republican's name, but it's actually a co-chair instead of ranking member, and it has to have a supermajority support.
The best thing you could do would be for people to stay there. I would tell you this as a chairman. You had the House comes in on Monday night and leaves Thursday early afternoon or Tuesday or Friday. That means, in effect, you have one day that you can be sure to have committee meetings, because you can't have the, you have two. If they come on Monday night, you can have a meeting on Tuesday and Wednesday. You cannot have a committee meeting on what is called a getaway day. It's interesting in terms of what Bob said. The last day of the session is called getaway day. And people leave, you won't have a quorum to do any business. And that is part of the problem, the constrained time frame. So if you could, even if people are still going to go home, meet a full 4 days a week would be one thing. Beyond that, I can't think of too many structural things that would make a difference.
No frustrations, no rules or traditions. I'm trying to think. A lot of the rules about a bill must lay on the table for X days.
Oh, yeah.
And so on that's gum things up. It could be improved.
Interesting, even in the digital age, if you do not have a physical copy of the bill typed on the special engrossing typewriter, the law, it does not exist.
So that could be modernized.
Yeah, but that's right.
Staff compensation, something along those lines.
I would let increase the pay for personal staff.
Would you micromanage staff allocations in a way that?
No, they have to be even. Too much power to the leadership if there's no variation. Unlike state legislatures, where there is this, we certainly Massachusetts and some others, your office space, your staff allotment, and your travel budget are fixed for everybody, and there's no leadership influence. It'd be terrible if there was.
Sure. I guess the final question then for you, Congressman, is thinking broadly across your career in the House in particular, is there anything you'd wish you'd done differently as a lawmaker?
Well, I wish I'd come out earlier, but it was complicated by the fact that my friend Gary Studds had to come out. I wish I could have done that a couple years earlier.
When did he?
Well, he got caught in '83,
83.
so he had to go through the '84 election, and I didn't want to do it the very next election. There were a couple of votes I wish I had back. I tell you, the vote I think now was the biggest mistake was voting against I should have told Dimitri, George H.W. Bush's intervention in Kuwait. I was afraid that he was going to do in Kuwait what they did in Iraq, which is to go too far. But I do think it was surgical, and they got this terrible man out of Kuwait, and that was useful. Other than that, I guess one kind of demagogic vote on the IRS for something I wish I had it back. But no, I don't think, I can't think of anything I would have done very differently, or differently at all.
Well, we have it's interesting. Typically, as always, almost, we've ignored the greatest abdication of congressional power of any of our lifetimes, the power to declare war,
Yeah.
which has gotten us into more trouble and more expense and more sorrows, as we say in the Yiddish.
Actually, the encouraging, they just did it, and give Sanders credit for that. He spurred it to do it with regard to Yemen, and they actually first passed it.
Yeah.
But by the way, Bob is right about that, but the reason is very simple. There is no history of executive overreach and war making. There is a very clear history of congressional ducking of responsibility. Congress has been very happy to let the president do that and then complain.
Of course.
And finally on Yemen, it's the first time that they did speak out. But it is true, and it's a big problem. And Obama was guilty there as well. They took the AUF, the authorization of the use of force, that we passed after the 9/11 to authorize going to Afghanistan. And they've used that shamelessly way beyond that, including Obama. On the other hand, in fairness to Obama, when he did try, in fact, to take Congress into account, I was appalled by this, when he said that the chemical attack by Syria would be a red line, and then he didn't go forward. He asked Congress for the authority to do that, and they turned him down. And he was then denounced for abiding by the congressional refusal to authorize it, including by liberals in the New York Times. That was
Washington Post.
appalling.
All right.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you
Really
very
appreciate
much.
it.
This is good. It was fun.
No, this is